Let's rock, baby.
Devil May Cry's combo ranking system is probably the best way to describe how I feel about the game. It is overall quite stylish, with some absolutely awesome ideas, some cool moments, and a few things that sadly made the game feel a bit dull. But I have to say bravo for how the game turned out in the end, regardless of my personal distaste for Hideki Kamiya. Devil May Cry is a hack-and-slash action-adventure game released on August 23rd, 2001 for the PS2. It later got an HD re-release on all major home consoles and the PC, but I'll be taking a look at the PS3 version for this review. Devil May Cry started out its life as the first stage of development and ideas for Resident Evil 4. After going through many plot and gameplay changes in its production due to Kamiya wanting it to be a stylized action game, the original idea of having it be a Resident Evil game was scrapped. Kamiya rewrote the game to be about demons, and it became the game we know and love today. I bring this up not only because it is interesting to note, but it also causes some of the game's biggest problems and downfalls, but we will get to those in due time. For now, let's talk about the story. The story of Devil May Cry is incredibly bare bones until the last half hour or so of the game. We get a bit of context on the legendary knight Sparta, who defeated an evil many years ago so the Earth and its people could live in peace. After that, a mysterious woman by the name of Trish falls from the sky and then proceeds to crash her way into the bar by the titular name of Devil May Cry. This is where we meet the wisecracking, devil-slaying mercenary by the name of Dante, the protagonist of the game.
Well, what do we have here? Nature calls? It's in the back.
Trish assaults Dante, but Dante quickly brushes it off and tells Trish of his deceased mother and brother, giving her the reason why he hunts down demons. Trish tells Dante that Emperor Mundus, the being responsible for his family's death, is trying to return to Earth, and that he needs to put a stop to this. After that, they set off for a castle that I don't think ever gets a name, to make sure Mundus does not succeed in his plans. The story then gets tied up, thrown in the trunk, and doesn't even get the courtesy of being put in the back seat. Cutscenes become few and far between, and when they do happen, it is usually just done to introduce a boss or have Dante make a quick quip.
What a big surprise. I hope for your sake you got something inside that big body of yours.
The major story development doesn't come back into the game until after the first 2/3 of the game are over, but I do actually like what we get in terms of story, even if the story parts we get are incredibly brief. After the introduction, Trish just sort of leaves, and the game drops you off and lets you explore the castle. You'll come across combat, puzzles, and boss fights, and those are all quite frequent. But let's talk about the characters briefly since they are so beloved by fans. Dante is cool, plain and simple. He is a wisecracking and for the most part laid back individual who keeps his head in serious situations. He is honestly just a decent guy regardless of how his surroundings in his introduction look. He isn't given as much depth as I would like, but he does have some emotional scenes and I appreciate that they try to make him human. Although I will say with some of the line delivery they come off a bit goofy when they really shouldn't. I wish he had more screen time in cutscenes, but for the length of the game, what we learn and gather about him, it isn't a bad start. Thankfully, we get sequels to expand on his character. Trish was pretty darn dull for a good chunk of the game. She did get a bit better, but her motives for everything that she does in the game are so muddled, and the ending with her is cheesy and over the top and quite silly, but I did enjoy it and smiled quite a bit when all was said and done. Mundus was so boring up until the final boss fight, and you didn't even see him until then. But oh boy was his reveal cool when we actually were introduced to him on screen. Up until this moment though, he has one or two voice lines where he says something, then vanishes for another giant chunk of the game. He's just a force of evil that Dante has to put a stop to. Cool boss fight, lame villain overall. The environments are both very nice to look at and extremely bland all at the same time. They all have a very familiar feeling to them, and they don't start to get super varied in appearance until you leave the main halls of the castle. I do like the architecture on display here, but there's so many browns in the color scheme that it was refreshing to see some lighter colors outside. Not to say that there were all that many, sadly. There was some variety in the locations, even if they all looked a bit similar to each other here and there. The castle, a coliseum, a sunken pirate ship, and more. The stages at least did do different things with how they were set up. I can't really say I had a favorite level out of any of them, but I will say right now I didn't downright hate or even dislike any of them. My huge problem with the levels is that there was just no reason to explore or venture off the beaten paths the game has. Why, may I ask, did the game feel like it had to have underwater sections in the game? While these were thankfully over relatively quickly, they were clunky to control, especially with the inverted controls and poor weapon accuracy. It felt like playing a bad version of Descent. The game was quite odd in terms of graphics. The game itself looked like an upscale PS2 game and looks overall pretty nice. The cutscenes that used the in-game graphics looked alright as well, but when you had the pre-rendered cutscenes, they were compressed and out of aspect. So outside of anything actually in-game, it was an incredibly mixed bag of what the quality was going to be. The sound was another sort of weird thing as well. The soundtrack was fine and dandy, and the audio for everything was fine in-game, but for the cutscenes of characters talking, at least for the first half of the game, it was a bit grainy and hard to understand anything they would say.
Right. I'm his son, Dante. Sweet dreams.
Mix this with the lack of cutscenes for anyone but bosses, and I had to strain my ears to hear whatever was being said. Thankfully, this issue did appear to resolve itself later in the game, but it is still annoying, and it was this way for way too long in the beginning. The music for the game is alright, with some of the tracks going as far to get me a bit excited for the battles or set pieces I encountered, but I wouldn't really consider listening to the soundtrack outside of the game itself. The combat in the game is brilliantly overrated. It is a lot of fun, but man, people overhype how in-depth the combat system is. The game works on a combo ranking system, and this is cool in theory, but to put actual use in game, I didn't really find myself caring all that much about what the words flashing on the screen said, as long as the enemy I was hitting died without doing any damage to me. The combo ranking system is neat in theory, but when you're spamming the same air raid attack to get the best rank, something's not quite right. There were different moves you could purchase with red orbs, the game's form of currency. You would get these for smashing up things around the environment, killing enemies, or beating levels with a certain rank. I rarely ever felt like I was getting enough orbs to upgrade my weapons throughout the level though. I assumed I'd get more end level bonus orbs if my style rank was higher, but I still wasn't getting that many even when I did improve my end level rank. Upgrades were a big disappointment. Not only did they cost way more than I feel like they should have for how few orbs you get, they also didn't feel that great to use. Some of them were downright annoying, like that one that allowed you to fly spinning at enemies. Others I just flat out ignored, like most of the upgrades for the fire gauntlets you got later in the game. You could actually purchase items with the red orbs, and this would be great if said items actually respawned when you did. Yeah, if you die and are forced to use the yellow orb to respawn, any item you use before that death is gone unless you reload a save. This means that you have wasted all those red orbs on an item that you didn't even get to use. Also, items became more expensive the more you bought them. I get why this is, but coupled with the respawning mechanic, it was really annoying. I hated the lives mechanic for the sole reason. I like that the game spawns you immediately outside of the room you just died in, but once you lose all your lives, you're forced to make your way through the entire level all over again, or back to the previous save. Couple that long backtrack with potential items lost, this made the few times I actually did die during the game severely frustrating. I didn't actually die all that often for the first couple of hours of the game, but once I reached a few of the later bosses, this quickly changed due to some cheap tactics used by the game. Weapons and combat were both pretty darn enjoyable for the most part. When I landed a sequence of spot-on hits and killed an enemy or a crowd of them, it felt really good. The melee weapons, with the exceptions of the fist, all had a good heft to them, but the projectile weapons you get are a bit weightless feeling. The base sword you get is quickly upgraded to a better weapon, so other than getting a badass cutscene, I see no reason why the game didn't just start you with Alistair. Ebony and Ivory are the best guns outside the shotgun, with the others being fun to try out, but not being all that useful. The experimental laser weapon was cool for one of the boss fights, but then was quickly made void by a later boss who absorbs the damage it deals. It also doesn't help that any weapon after the shotgun, with the exclusion of the water gun, were all quite slow to fire. The bigger sword and gauntlets you get later on were fun concepts, but again, like with the guns, I stuck to what is essentially the game's default weapon of Alistair. Not that they didn't serve their purpose for puzzles or story, it's just with them, their abilities and damage still weren't something I found myself using after their initial reveal. Also, there's a weapon later in the game that not only didn't let you upgrade it, but also didn't let you enter Devil Trigger mode. This made me use it the least right along the sword you start out with. Speaking of Devil Trigger mode, it was a fun concept that rewarded you for landing hits on enemies. After you get Alistair, you're able to press R1 and L1 at the same time to go into a mode that lets you perform certain moves, do more damage, and regain a bit of health. You could power it up by either landing hits while it was switched off, or if you you bought power-ups. It, alongside your health, could be upgraded with collectibles and ore purchases, which I liked. Here comes the biggest problem with the combat in Devil May Cry, and that is the fixed camera angles. Not only were they the biggest problem with the combat, but they also caused major problems in a lot of the game's sections in general, especially the platforming. Thankfully, there was no way to die in the platforming sections, but having to do them all over again was a big time waster and not fun in the slightest. This is why I brought up the fact that it was originally going to be a Resident Evil game. I just wish the camera angles were either fully controllable or positioned better at the very least. With the poorly placed fixed cameras, you would have to readjust your thumb as to not run into potential death that was the way you were just running away from. The game is supposed to be fast paced, but the camera does nothing but slow it down. It also doesn't help when enemies have projectile attacks and are off screen. The enemies in the game were okay, and I liked them in the beginning, but I found it odd that certain enemies kept showing up in places I wouldn't expect them to. Having the marionette guys appear outside was a bit weird to me, and not having ice enemies react to the fire gauntlets was lame. I did like how there was both a standard version of an enemy along with a heavier hitting version of them, although I hated the ice lizards and fire grim reapers. Both of these variants took too much damage to take down and were almost always positioned in an area where you would need as much health as you could have, such as before a boss fight. I preferred when these enemies stuck to being rare mini-bosses as opposed to being slightly more uncommon enemies. Bosses were great the first time you fought them, then alright the second time you fought them, and then you're just going to wish they had different bosses by the third or fourth time you fight them. In fact, one of the bosses has you fight previous bosses inside of its own boss fight if it captures you. I would have preferred if boss fights either only happened once with multiple stages or twice with a new moveset thrown in the second time around. I just wish the game didn't lazily rehash bosses with a single new move the next time you fight them. The only boss that felt different with different ways of fighting him was the last boss, and that's because one part of it turned into frickin' Space Harrier. The puzzles were thankfully fairly easy and quick to solve, and I appreciated that they didn't take you away from the action too often. I'm not a huge fan of puzzles in a game like this, but here they were used sparingly, and I didn't actually end up hating them. So if a game can have puzzles outside of being a puzzle game and not have me dislike them or take away the player from the flow of the game, I'll give credit where credit is due. After you beat the game for the first time, you unlock New Game Plus, which carries certain items and stats over and allows you to play through the game on the harder difficulty modes and unlock different character skins for subsequent playthroughs. Overall, I really did enjoy Devil May Cry, even with all its faults. It is a fun, occasionally tough action game that tends to get overhyped by its fan base. If you can learn enemy patterns and when to use Devil Trigger mode, the game is actually a breeze up until the last 30 minutes or so. Although it does lack a major narrative, it has enough story and charm in the end to win me over, despite a lack of drive and motive here and there throughout the story. The game showed a lot of promise, and I'm really glad it ending up becoming a series, because man, the ending really kicked open the doors for more of these games to be made, so the formula and story could be improved. So with all that said, if you enjoy action games, go out and give this a play. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video and want to support the channel, consider sharing the video with your friends or checking out my Patreon linked in the description below. I adore getting comments and having discussions, so please feel free to talk down below in the comments. I read and reply to everything. If you have any recommendations for games, movies, or anime you would like me to review, let me know. I'll see you all in the next video. This is Thierry Williamson signing off until next time. See you guys!